Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you also for inviting an historian of early modern Europe to a conference on tafsir. I've learned an enormous amount today and enjoyed every minute. So I think what I can offer as a small token of my gratitude is perhaps a piece of practical advice as an historian of early modern Europe. In the unlikely event of you solving the theoretical and practical and technical, seemingly insurmountable challenges to time travel, as an historian, I'd like to urge you strongly not to travel to Zwickau or anywhere in Central Europe during the 30 Years' War, and you'll see why. Zwickau now is a wonderful and very interesting town. It's improved greatly since the 30 Years' War, but stay out of it in the first half of the 17th century, since the town is a truly horrible place to live and a gruesome place to die between 1618 and 1648. The town's inhabitants suffered directly from warfare and, worse yet, were frequently afflicted by the concomitant scourges of war, hunger and repeated outbreaks of the bubonic plague. Now, why on earth am I telling you all this? The reason I'm sharing this information with you is that during one such bubonic outbreak in the city, which was particularly lethal, a man in his 50s, a schoolmaster of the Latin school in Zwickau, decided it was time to take positive action to solve the problem. His pupils were dying off like flies, and this was obviously the plague and the war, obviously divine punishment for the sinfulness of this Lutheran town. So he dropped all the normal subjects. He stopped reading Cicero and Virgil, which is what he's paid to do, and for several weeks, as a good Lutheran, concentrated on the 7 penitential psalms with his students. So far, this is not unusual and seemingly completely irrelevant to our meeting today. However, unusual and highly relevant, I would argue, for our convention here, is the fact that this pious undertaking gave birth to one of Zechendorf's most bizarre works. Now, he claims to have read the Psalms in over 30 translations with his young pupil. And this gave birth to one of his most bizarre works, which is still unpublished. It remains in a single manuscript. It's a Quranic paraphrase of the 7 penitential psalms, where each verse of the penitential psalm is coupled with a series of pseudo-Quranic verses, which give an estimation of the tenor of these verses. Now, in the German preface to this bizarre work, Zechendorf explains that it was a byproduct both of his Lutheran piety during a terrible period, and at the same time, also a schoolmaster's practical guide for his pupils. He was reading the Qur'an in Arabic with some of his pupils in the Latin school in Zwickau, in Arabic original, was hoping that this work would help them be better acquainted with Quranic phraseology. Now, I leave it to you to decide what's more remarkable. The fact that Zechendorf's imitation of Quranic verses as a form of pious Lutheran meditation during the 30 Years' War, or the fact that Arabic lessons were offered to 10-year-old pupils, 13-year-old pupils in Zwickau. Now, Zechendorf was indeed exceptional. And this is by far not the typical fare of Saxon school children in the 17th century or later. That goes without saying. He was an exceptional scholar, and his self-taught Arabic was carried out mostly in sad isolation. While most of his work was never printed, he did, however, publish 2 separate publications. The Arabic text of, yes, the title page, which is fairly boring, but they have his. There's of course no printer in Zwickau can print Arabic, so these are wooden, it's like potato stamps. One of his pupils cut out Arabic parts. So these are 2 separate translations of 4 very short surahs, the 61-78, and a few years later 101, 103. The latter, and this is interesting, which isn't the one you have in front of you, the latter 2 surahs translated in light of Baidawi's tafsir, which Zechendorf received as a gift. This is extremely rare. The use by a European scholar, even of someone teaching at universities, of tafsir in the early 17th century is very rare. And this is no point, there are reasons it's rare, and I won't go into them now. But it's an interesting fact. There's an argument argumentum ex silencio, the fact that tafsir is used very sparingly by European scholars. Now, in addition to that, he also claims in his correspondence to have translated the entire Qur'an into Latin, but unfortunately he couldn't find a printer in Zwickau who could blame him. Now, I was skeptical when scholars are very fond of exaggerating their achievements in it. However, Roberto Totoli, who is also, by coincidence, also the PI of our Naples team, I'll get to immediately, discovered some years ago in Cairo, of all places, in fact, in Sechendov's very distinct handwriting, a translation of the entire Quran. Now, Sechendov is, of course, just one tiny case study but what I'd like to think that in many ways, as eccentric as he is, he's an instructive case study for the kind of work we're doing in our project. Now, again, it goes without saying that he's an outlier, he's exceptional. However, at the same time, a closer look at the history of European engagement with Islam and with the Quran, more specifically, shows that Sechendov was perhaps exceptional and something of an eccentric, to be honest. However, he was, by all measures, part of a far broader, very serious phenomenon, which we are studying in our ERC Synergy project called the European Quran. And the stress really is on the European Quran, not the Quran in Europe, but the European Quran, the Muslim scripture in Europe between the 12th century and the 19th century. In a nutshell, the project as a whole, the Synergy, 6-year Synergy project as a whole, is a broad collaborative project involving 4 principal investigators. Mercator Foundation of Madrid, a leading expert on the Muslim heritage of Spain, Iberia. John Tolan, the Université de Nantes, an expert on encounters with Islam and the Muslim world in medieval Latin Europe. Roberto Totoli of Naples, an eminent Arabist and expert on Quranic Arabic. And Jan Lok of the University of Copenhagen, an historian and leading expert on the history of Oriental scholarship in early modern Europe. Now, each head of these ERC teams has a team of PhD and postdoctoral researchers. This large research team offers a long series of case studies, which I can't go into now, but a series of case studies of European engagement with the Quran, spanning from the 11th century to the 19th century. And even one of our colleagues even pursued this into the early 20th century, the Romanov Empire. Spanning geographically from the British Isles to the Russian Empire, and chronologically again from the High Middle Ages to the early 19th century. We're also working on an online database of Qurans, both Quran manuscripts in Europe, European libraries, but even more importantly, European editions and translations of the Quran, and European works of scholarship which are involved, which make a significant use of the Quran in any and other sort of Quranically related publications. Now, a subject as rich, and with a team which includes Arabists, codicologists, experts on religious studies of medieval Europe, early modern historians like my humble self, Byzantologists, experts on Spanish and French literature, and so on and so forth. Any attempt of an exhaustive overview in my 15 minutes of fame, I think, would be to court disappointment. Allow me, instead, to make a few general comments, very general, brief comments, and then introduce briefly the ERC team I have the good fortune of working with in Copenhagen. Roughly how much time have I?
No. 9 minutes.
Wonderful. Okay. So, I would say there are essentially two avenues, 2 paths you could take in looking at the question of the European Quran. One is perhaps that it's a happy coincidence that I'm presenting our project directly after Professor Bink's discussion of the modern uses, translations in their historical context. One way is in an early modern context, if you will, would be perhaps what you call the philological highway. That is an account of early pre-modern, medieval and early modern translations of the Quran. And there is another avenue, which I'll discuss very briefly at the end. I could go on all day, and I know I'm not allowed to, about Quran, something I'm passionate about Quran translations from the 16th century way into up to Rückert in the German context, something I'm very passionate about. but I think we won't have lunch soon. So let me just give you just one sample, again, maybe an anecdote which makes the... when we deal with Quranic translations in this project, anyone about BRC, the idea is not so much in this kind of classic and in itself very worthy tradition, Philologiegeschichte, that's not what we're aiming at, but rather, like Zechendorf is just a memorable anecdote, in a very much, to use Goethe, a kind of thick description of the historical and cultural embedment. Let me just give you a tiny example, which is, I think, paradigmatic for the kind of work. So, to give just one example. In 1616, good-looking gentleman in front of you, in 1616, an elderly Nuremberg pastor by the name of Salomon Schweiger published his translation, German translation of the Quran. This was the first ever German translation of the Quran, and one of the first translations of the Quran into a vernacular as opposed to Latin in Europe. Now, you'd be right to ask yourself, how on earth does a Nuremberg preacher possess enough Arabic? There are no reliable Arabic grammars at the time, although there's opinions, which I doubt he read, but it's a bit too early. How on earth did he master Arabic to the standard to allow him to translate the Quran? And the answer is very simple, he didn't. And he was an honest man, he never pretended to know a word of Arabic. He translated the Quran from Italian. There's a 1547 translation in Venice, Italian translation, and he actually knew Italian. Okay, well that merely shifts the question that you asked, well, where did the Italian, 16th century Italian translator know Arabic well enough? And he was less honest, he pretended to know Arabic, but in fact he probably didn't speak a word of Arabic, he translated it from Latin. The Latin translation for Quran is indeed by a 12th century English astronomer, mathematician, Robert of Ketton, who translated the Quran in Iberia. This Latin translation was then published 400 years after it was written, was published in Basel in 1543 and became a standard text and became even a source of further translations. Just to end, because I'm getting carried away with translations, it's dangerous. In 1641 appeared the first Dutch translation of the Quran, this time translated directly from Schweiger's German. Most Quran translators in early modern Europe didn't know a word of Arabic. This, of course, has to do, of course, with translation practices in Europe. The Quran didn't fare worse than other texts. Two important exceptions are, of course, André Durier, the French translation, 1637, who translated his French translation was made directly from the Arabic, and in turn, you guessed already, became the basis of a long series of other European languages translated from even the Russian translation much later in the 19th century. And Ludovico Maracci, at the very end of the 17th century, his monumental Latin and Arabic edition of the Quran, together with tafsir, a large selection of tafsir, and a pious refutation of Islam. All I want to say here, and I'll close, there's a lot more to say about translation, but how worthwhile it is to treat them not from a strictly philological point of view, whether they're accurate or inaccurate, they're mostly outrageously they're not always accurate, however, but rather within the historical and cultural context. There's clearly a book market, for instance. Printers in Europe clearly have also a commercial interest. There is an interest, a learned interest among Latinate readership, but there is more and more German, English, French, and other language who would like to read the Quran. But we'll leave this aside and come to a few concluding points. For all the importance, however, and back to Zechendorf, that's fine. The translations, of course, are just a part of a much broader context, Sitz im Leben. And here I'd like very briefly to end with my wonderful colleagues. This one, let's skip this. And just very briefly tell you what we're up to and leave the question. Dr. Afif, Neema Afif, is working on early modern Hebrew translations. There were two unpublished Hebrew translations of the Quran, none of them made from Hebrew. And she shows very interesting, there's a very interesting cultural, even commercial context, which she's looking at. Paul Babinski is a great expert on the circulation of Oriental manuscripts in Europe, and they're used in the way European scholars use them. Kentaro Inagaki, our PhD student, is doing a truly innovative and exciting work on the life of Levinas Warner, a German scholar who lived in Istanbul for many years, working on this. And Octavian Negoitia is a Byzantologist, working actually on post-Byzant, on 16th and 17th century Greek thinkers and use of the Qur'an. And last and least, my Humboldt Sober, together with my good friend Jan Noor, are working on a monograph with the working title of The Uses of the Qur'an in Early Modern Europe. There's much more to say, but I've abused your patience for 15 minutes. Thank you very much.